what we're going to do with that. Thank you for all those people who've attended and signed up early. Timekeeping is clearly a matter of priority for you. So as the first people registered and signed into this webinar, you get the opportunity to post your question before anybody else joins this conversation. So if you've got a question that you are burning to ask, and we've got a number of questions that we're trying to or attempt to ask and answer as well in this webinar. So if you'd like to do that, please post that in the chat to our panelists, Matt, Chris A and Chris F as well. I'd be delighted to add that to the 35 we've already had prior to the webinar there. So feel free to do that and use the chat, or if you want to post it anonymously, you can do so by clicking on the question and answer speech bubble, which is at the top of your toolbar there. Got a couple of seconds before we get started beforehand. So thank you very much indeed for joining us on this Elephants Don't Forget webinar, where we discuss with our colleagues from consultancy firm Bovill, Newgate and charity the Money Advice Trust, the recent FCA publication on delivering good outcomes for customers in vulnerable circumstances, good practices and areas for improvement. Our aim over the next 60 minutes or 59 minutes is not to regurgitate chapter and verse of the FCA's published review. Where would the fun in that be? Instead, we opted to provide you with ideas, examples and proven practices that we hope will help your firm narrow that gap between the outcomes experienced by vulnerable customers compared to non-vulnerable customers there. To aid us in this task, delighted to welcome to the panel Dr. Chris Fitch as well from the Money Advice Trust there, and Mr. Adlard from Elephants Don't Forget, as well as Matt Brown from Bovill Newgate here. We're here to serve. We're here to serve. And so the opportunity to post your questions, challenge us on our paradigms, obviously ask us to explain or unpack key issues over the next 60 minutes are critical to help us steer the webinar and also give you the support and also the understanding that you need to actually make headway in your approach to vulnerability there. We're going to do that in covering 5 points. These are the points that you will notice from the review: governance and outcomes monitoring, of course, consumer support, customer understanding, product and service design, but also the last one, which is the driver or the engine room of actually driving that through the organization, which is culture and leadership there. And by the way, for those people who've just joined the webinar, you can post questions which we will welcome throughout the webinar as well. Challenge us on our thinking, because I think that without you, we can't actually personalize it to what you want us to do. Now, when we sat down to unpack this webinar, we said that our intention was to say something new. Okay, right, say something new on that. Also unpack some generalities on this. And the reason why we said that is that there's a lot of grey area around this. So we want to nuance itself into specific outcomes and outputs as well, and also provide different viewpoints. But also, and this is what Matt came up with, decode the FCA's challenge. What's beneath what they're saying in this? Moving away from theory, but also giving some practical examples and some tips. As ever, we love our webinar poll questions. So let's kick off the offering by actually asking you to actually see what you think on this particular question, which is: which of the following methods do you primarily use to monitor the outcomes of your vulnerable customers? Which of the following methods do you primarily use to monitor the outcomes of your vulnerable customers? And you can choose many of the options that you see on the screen before. Welcome, Chris A, Chris F. Sorry if I sound like the army here for the next 45 minutes on that, but it sounds like DJ names: Chris A, Matt B, and Chris F on the decks. So without that, Matt, you go first on this. What did you think of the review? How's it landed with your clients?
Interestingly, I think a lot of clients are still processing how this fits into their broader consumer duty implementation. It kind of has that vibe that this is really just the tip of the iceberg, and that realistically, when you look at the feedback, a lot of it could equally apply to all customers, not just vulnerable customers. And I think that's right. Trying to implement vulnerable customers just on its own doesn't really work. It's not sustainable. You kind of want to have it as part of that holistic view around customers generally.
Indeed. And so, Chris F., when you see what methods firms, and I would say that 1,600 people signed up to this webinar, many of those through across the sector, so insurance, as well as retail banking, wealth management, and other organizations signing up to this webinar. And so when you see these figures depicted on the screen here, this could be argued that it's a cross-sector understanding of where they are in their the vulnerability journey. Chris F., complaints data still the leading answer in terms of like metrics or outcomes that they're monitoring. Is that right? Is that what you're seeing?
Absolutely. But to go back just to what Matt was saying, I think one of the things we will seek to unpack in this discussion is whether you can just rely on the consumer duty framework to deliver for vulnerability. And we've seen in clients that we've worked with in the past, particularly new entrants who've relied on consumer duty, that actually it hasn't delivered on vulnerability because you don't have that granularity that you might have by looking through complaints data. I think the other thing I'd quickly add as well, Philip, is just because the words are familiar in the FCA's review doesn't mean you've heard it all before or that you've understood it. I'll give you a quick example. I noticed that the FCA have started talking about tailoring services. It's mentioned 19 times in the main review document compared to just twice in the 2021 vulnerability guidance. But that raises questions. What's a tailored service? Could it cost firms more to provide? And how far should firms go in relation to vulnerability?
Good one there. You love an NPS score, don't you, Chris? Saying
Not my own, but kind of a kind of.
I think briefly on the reflection from the FCA's update, I think it's really encouraging the fact that they put so much more emphasis on outcomes. In my mind, outcomes aren't just a reaction to, for example, complaints data coming in, but how do you really build vulnerability into product and service design? So I think the narrative probably needs to shift a bit more in terms of proactive design around vulnerability rather than just reacting to things as they come through the call center, for example.
we wanted to shout out to individuals as well as organizations the progress that organizations had made and continue to make on their vulnerability journey. And I think that that is recognized by the FCA as well. Not only great sandwiches apparently at the review, but also the opportunity for firms to actually recognize that there is good work being done. And it's great that the regulator is also acknowledging that point. When you look at training though, Chris, there is still room for improvement in this.
Yeah, honestly, it was great and really encouraging that the FCA talked a lot about the need for really effective training, but there is arguably more work to be done, not just to train staff, but to make sure they're truly competent at both supporting vulnerable customers and building that vulnerability into product and service design. So, elephants don't forget, we really do talk about that issue of employee competence, not just staff training.
Yeah, Chris F. Money Advice Trust has trained over 60,000 individuals there. Is there too much reliance on perhaps forms of e-learning and other, I would say, old school ways of actually approaching training as opposed to doing different things with different segments of your population or your staff?
I was really surprised by the so once the review came out, there was seemed to be a real rush of training providers saying, "Hey, we've got all the answers," and we didn't do that in the Money Advice Trust because we've gone away and rewritten what we have because we think in the same way the FCA is saying actually firms are not delivering outcomes. I think those who are providing solutions, training, learning development have to go away and think, well, what part did we play in this and what haven't we done? What do we need to address? I think what we're going to see more of though, Philip, is role relevant training. as opposed to the great sheep dip, whether that's done kind of in the classroom or it's done by the spacebar pressing marathon of e-learning. We're going to see a lot more attention to actually what not just our design team, but our QA team, our complaints team, our data architecture team. What do they need in terms of that golden thread around vulnerability?
Mm. And I know that elephants don't forget, champions of learning reinforcement there. It's what you do after the training as well that counts just as much as actually what you do on the training, Chris.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you said it really well. And making sure that not just that staff are trained, but they're tested on scenarios, they're tested on their competence around, all these topics around consumer duty, but especially around vulnerability.
So what we've done on the next few slides is actually identify the key findings of the report on the left-hand side. We also then go through the blockers. So what basically stops an organisation from moving forward on some of the challenges that the FCA expects you to address? And then what we've done is that we've actually looked at good practices as well as questions that you can take away. So yes, this is the cut out and keep playbook that you can take away and actually ask within your organisations the following questions. So Matt, kick us off. When you look at governance and outcomes monitoring, there's still a lot of room for improvement. And a lot of firms, as you said prior to the webinar, scratching their heads thinking, actually, what does good look like? I'm baffled that still identifying good outcomes is still a challenge for many firms.
Yeah, and it is. And I think that it was interesting when you look at the FCA report about their concern more generally around the definition of an outcome, because I think it's an exercise in which I've seen a lot of firms wrestle with what seems like a relatively simple exam question. What outcome do you want your customers to get? What outcomes do you want to avoid your customers getting? And I think that's where actually it's really important to get close to on the ground to really talking to customers. And we'll come on to this a little bit later, but I think that conversation with customers about what experiences they have when they work with our firms and what they're hoping to achieve is part of the thing that's missing from a lot of the dialogue is listening to our customers. And the most silent among them are our vulnerable customers. So how do we access them? How do we get their stories? How do we understand their experiences? So I think a theoretical understanding of outcomes is great and all, and we can all do that to an extent, but we really need to start talking to customers to better understand what outcomes they're seeking and what outcomes they actually end up getting. And I think another part of this then is that data. If you don't ask the right questions, you don't get the right answers. So you get rubbish in, rubbish out is what a lot of the MI was. We look back to TCF days, endless reams of MI, none of us knew what to do with it. And there's a risk that consumer duty is going to generate the same thing. And when it comes to these vulnerable customers, my lord, it's a really tragic thing when you actually hear the true stories for vulnerable customers, and then you look for the data that tells their stories. It's not there. So again, we're not asking the right questions sometimes, which means that we get the wrong answers back. And no surprise, it's really hard to then come up with a solution.
Mm. The FCA picks up on the governance point, doesn't it? Saying there's a lack of escalation. Accountability and ownership, big issue still.
I think that this is something that's really hard for a lot of senior leadership team. They're dealing with a lot of balls. They're juggling an awful lot of problems. And how do they get to access these very small stories sometimes that really illustrate the impact they're having on customers at the end? They'll be wrestling with what's going on with their balance sheet, their distribution pipeline, the suppliers, the procurement team, marketing, and all of the other parts of the business, which are complicated enough as it is. But let's be honest, no business is worth its salt without its customers. That's the fundamentals of every single one of our businesses. And yet we don't talk enough about them. And I think we'll come on to this again in a little bit, but actually that idea of who owns customer outcome is really important. Now, ideally, you'd say everybody's got skin in the game, but there also does need to be somebody on that senior team that sees that their role is principally about ensuring that there are customers who, if they're not getting the right outcome, it's being spotted and it's being addressed. And that idea of an accountable individual in the senior team is something that I think we need to see more of. And interestingly, the FCA has just decommissioned the idea of a consumer champion in and around of the consumer duty, which I thought was a fairly bemusing thing to do at the same time as issuing these findings. And I would encourage a lot of firms to maybe think twice before you start getting rid of your consumer champions.
That's key challenge number one. Yeah, interesting point. Yes, and I think we took notes and notice of that there. And Chris Fitch, shouldn't all staff and members, riffing off what Matt B was saying there, I've gone into my DJ mode again. Matt B has said that in terms of like grasping and understanding what a good outcome is, if you can't define it, then your staff don't know it, and if your staff don't know it, how could they possibly position products and services to be suitable for that demographic or for that segment of the marketplace?
Absolutely. I think there are three basic fundamental questions that we have to ask around vulnerability. First one is vulnerable to what? What harm, what disadvantage, what detriment, what loss, what exclusion? Second one is supported how? How are we going to support them? And the third one is, if not us providing that support, then who? Those are the three questions, whether you're a board or frontline or in a design team. If you can answer them about individual customers or aggregate groups of customers, you're in a much better place. And they're really keenly linked into outcomes. So let's take that vulnerable to what? We keep talking about kind of what's a good outcome, but there's two sides to a coin. And the other side to this is what's a bad outcome? And this is the land bridge that exists between the vulnerability guidance, FG 21/1, and the consumer duty, FG 22/5. It is this notion of harm, foreseeable harm. So I think what you need to be doing when you're trying to define and develop and measure your outcomes is think, okay, what's my taxonomy of harm? What are the harmful outcomes we want to avoid? Things like restricted access or unrealized benefits or financial difficulty or failure to protect. Because if we can identify what the bad outcomes are in our taxonomy of harm, actually we can begin to put those measures in place to define when they might be tripped or triggered, and we can take steps to prevent them or respond to them to minimize that harm. So don't just focus on good outcomes, focus on the bad outcomes as well.
Chris A, what other improvements can firms make on this webinar to actually go to what Chris is saying, which is actually shifting the focus towards defining and robustly identifying good outcomes?
I think the point about, was a great point Chris made about thinking about potential harm, so avoiding foreseeable harm and planning for good outcomes. It's about applying the so what test. So once you define the outcomes you're trying to achieve, then test yourself to make sure you've got the right data to measure that. And don't just rely on existing sources. For example, just looking at your NPS scores or your Trustpilot scores or Smart Money People. How is that really going to show you that you're avoiding foreseeable harm for your vulnerable and resilient customers? So yeah, it's about being clear about the outcomes and having data that will prove that those outcomes are being delivered.
And that means to say you've got to be honest enough and actually evaluate and assess, Matt, your outcomes monitoring framework. And with only 2 board meetings to go, perhaps before submissions of your consumer duty report, you better know that it's fit for purpose.
And you've got to be, I think there's a point around culture here, which is you've got to be questioning whether the data is really giving you what you need, and you've got to be asking what is it not answering. I think there's a great comment that's been made in the Q&A around the fact that sometimes complaints channels are not accessible in themselves. And we've seen in the poll that the vast majority of us use complaints data as a key metric of whether or not we're doing the right thing by our customers. But for vulnerable customers in particular, accessing that complaints channel, being able to make a complaint is sometimes a hell of a lot harder than you might imagine. So this is why, again, going back to Chris's point earlier, we need to be more proactive in trying to get information from our customers rather than passively waiting for that information to come to us. So for everybody that is on the webinar today, when you're looking at your MI, if you're leaning on your complaints data as the key metric, I challenge you not to do that. I think it's a great insight and it's useful. And when you do really good analysis of root cause, it can be immensely helpful, but don't lean on it entirely because it's not going to tell you the full picture.
And it's not forward-looking, Chris, F, is it? We've got one posted in the chat. I want to pose it to you to open up our section on consumer support. It says competence, question mark. How far do we go? We're not qualified counsellors. Could be dangerous to become too involved in this. I think there's I understand the sentiment of the question there, but on consumer support, more needs to be done in this area by firms.
So I think it goes back to those three questions. Your role is to identify the type of harm, whether it's in an individual interaction or whether it's with an aggregate group of data. What type of harms are our customers vulnerable to? We then draw a line in the sand by saying, okay, how do we support them? We've recently published at Money Advice Trust help. We've described it, help exclamation mark. We've described it as a mini support guide for the confused, which we list by contact channel, lots of different types of support and reasonable adjustments. And I think it's really key to be clear about what you can do. But that third question is, if not us, then who? That draws another line in the sand to say, actually, our expertise, our business model means that these types of support are relevant, reasonable, realistic, and required by law and regulation. But these ones are beyond us. So I understand the sentiment of the question. I think it's a great question, but I think it's about being really, really clear for consistency where you draw those lines in the sand and you're asking these questions repeatedly.
And yeah, the FCA acknowledges the headline figure, which caught everybody's attention when the review was published, was identification and disclosure. And I don't know how many webinars we've done together, Chris, about talking about identification and disclosure, about that. Are firms making the progress to meet the expectations of the regulator now, or is this really a challenge where firms are still scratching their heads about?
Yeah, some customers are never going to disclose. Some customers don't know they're vulnerable to harm or won't recognize it themselves, and a proportion will. So we've got to think for that proportion that will, how do we create a disclosure environment where we send the right signals, and those signals are reassuring. They're there to combat the fears that people have about how we're going to use any disclosure of something that's quite sensitive or personal to them. And we give them mechanisms, routine opportunities to disclose this, from onboarding, routine kind of annual contact, case review, account review, whatever contact points we have, we're continually saying you can disclose to us, and we're sending these signals of reassurance. If we do that, then we'll see disclosure rates start to increase. But at the moment, we don't just focus on disclosure. You have to focus on your data, your design, your identification, and I know we'll come to them a bit later on.
Fantastic. And Chris A, and by the way, we will be sending the slides, and yes, Chris F will send you the publication that he name checked there as well. And yes, we also send you further resources and how-to guides after the webinar, if that's okay with yourselves. Processes tick, systems tick. Chris A, what about people?
Yeah, I think we're going to touch on culture later, but it's essential that this isn't just about following a set of steps to ensure that you're proactively removing foreseeable harm. It's also about making people across the entire business fired up about the fact that your business cares about vulnerability, that whether it's in product design, whether it's in the contact center, whether it's in operations, customer support, in communications, that everyone has that in mind as they build products, as they service the customers, and that vulnerability is a top of mind issue for executives and the board as well. In fact, one of the points Matt made earlier was bringing those anecdotes to the board and to the executive team around where things perhaps have gone wrong for customers with vulnerability. So, cultural change is just as important as it is about following processes.
Matt, you raised something which is interesting. We had a good debate before the webinar about that heads of compliance, heads of risks, people who are leading on vulnerability. How do they get cut through at senior management levels because there'll be some senior managers who would say, well, tell us something from the report that we didn't know already. Do more, do it better, and do it more often. And you posed the challenge back to me about it's very difficult, perhaps in this current environment, to petition for resources and staff to support the expectations of the regulator. Do you want to unpack that in a bit more detail? So
Yeah,
you get the more love hearts from this if you actually empathise with more heads of compliance and heads of risk, you see.
I do, because I think that for a lot of firms, it's difficult to even know that what you're doing doesn't cut the mustard. It's like when you're looking around in your own organization and you can see the progress that you've already made, it feels like you're getting there, right? I've not met a firm yet that hasn't put effort into addressing its approach to customers generally, but vulnerable customers in particular. But then you've got to ask the question, where are you relative to the rest of the market, and where are you relative to what the FCA expects? And it's difficult when you're looking inwards to know whether or not you've got there yet. So you've got this challenge with relative expectations and knowing where they are. Then you've also got the challenge of resources, because there's always a challenge from somebody within the senior leadership team that will say, you know, we could exhaust our entire financial resources to solve this problem. We're a commercial organization. When does it stop? And it is the idea of being fair to all customers could be an endless financial pit if you're not careful. And that's the wrestling game that everybody I see, both within operations teams and within compliance functions, face, which is being able to give their senior leadership team an understanding of, yes, we've made progress, but there's still further to go. How do we know that? Well, because we're looking at what others are doing, and we're kind of using advisors that can give us that insight. We're looking at what we're hearing from our colleagues in other organizations and trade associations, whatever it might be. And then anecdotes. I'm an economist by background, and I love numbers and spreadsheets, and as many as you can give me, I'm in my element. But you know what? When I do board observations, the thing that stands out the most, that lands the most, are stories of real people. And those stories of real customers' experiences are the ones that generate the most debate, the most discussion, and actually gets us often to the bottom of what we're really trying to achieve as businesses. And I think that that's something that we should be leveraging off more.
Okay, you get the most emojis from a question answered as well. Chris Fitch, no pressure. Consumer understanding then. So when we talk about consumer understanding, many firms would actually look at, hey, we do principle, seven pretty well in the organization. We're clear, we're fair, we're not misleading. What's the issue?
So just to kind of pick up one thing that Matt said there is, I think it is difficult for firms to work out where they stand. And when we work with firms, we try to bring in equivalent comparisons. However, the FCA, I interviewed Charlotte Clark, who's the director of cross-cutting policy and strategy for the Vulnerability Matters podcast that you can listen to. So 40 minutes of her providing more detail, well worth a listen. And I asked her, look, have firms been sort of shortchanged on the amount of information they've got back from the review? The review document is about 27 pages long, the main one, if you kind of print it out, 24, 27 pages long. You think about the number of surveys, over 700 surveys that they undertook, deep dives around power of attorney and bereavement. They looked at kind of some consumer outcome testing. So with the special seminars coming up, there's going to be sector specific seminars coming up. We might get a little bit more detail about where our sector or our product range sits, and I think that's really important. But to answer your question about consumer understanding, it's really easy to kind of answer, and I break it down to three things. Firstly, take the amount of time that you've been spending on creating communications that are clear and accessible, and reallocate 20% of that time to actually user testing with known consumer groups who are vulnerable to harm, because you're going to get a good return on that. So testing, 29%. We saw in the survey from the FCA, I think it was like 85% of senior leadership, or no, 85% of firms said they'd taken significant progress on design, but only 29% did testing. And I think that applies to the consumer understanding part as well. We're not testing our communications enough. And I don't just mean Flesh Kincaid, getting kind of an age grade for it, actually testing it, as Matt said, with real consumers. And it's that checking as well. In terms of consumer understanding, if it's a loan agreement or you are walking somebody through a product, get them to play back what their understanding of it is to ensure they are entering this in an informed way. So I think they would be the kind of rules of thumbs that I would take on that.
Chris A, build on that for us. You're not going to get consumer understanding if you don't get employees who are competent, capable, and also empowered as well by the organisation.
Yeah, I think one really practical way of getting to the heart of this issue is to really catalogue all the communications going out to your customers, looking at how many customers receive those comms, trying to do a risk assessment proactively of what is the foreseeable harm and severity of that communication, and then working through the improvement of those communications around removing jargon, simplifying language, making them as really, really simple to understand, and then testing them out with groups of customers. So a group of resilient customers, a group of vulnerable customers, and seeing whether they understand what's being put in front of them. And in order to make that happen, it's important to ensure that employees are competent to deliver that. So when a marketing team, for example, is building communications, are they considering aspects of vulnerability in that design process of the communications? And are they, by default, testing out those communications with groups of customers? Final point I'd make is, this isn't just about drawing a distinction between resilient and vulnerable customers. It's also about doing a really good job of personalizing the experience that you're delivering to customers anyway, so that you deliver better customer experiences and outcomes for all your clients, and therefore that will help you drive growth within your business. So for me, it's about doing the right thing by your customers, both vulnerable and resilient from a communications point of view.
Matt, do you want to build on that?
I think we've said it, but I think that there was an interesting nuance in all of this. Is I see a lot of firms when they do testing, often using, say, staff as a way of being able to do a first run of what the communications look like, and if those staff members understand, which might work as a good proxy for the general target market that you have. But again, for vulnerable customers, it might not, because you have to depend on the idea that you've got vulnerable staff members that are willing to participate, that are then able to be honest about their vulnerability and honest about what they don't understand. You know, as a way of testing, I think that it's got its values, but it's got its limitations. And I think this is where using properly designed testing strategies that are using experts, both in vulnerability and things like behavioral science, are an essential way in which you can get access to true insights rather than things that help you a little bit.
Chris F, I mean, you touched upon it in the product and service design element, and I grabbed this quote in our research. You know, the focus should be on designing for outcomes rather than designing for products and services. Would you agree with that?
So it's about understanding so the barriers or the challenges that different types of customer groups within your customer base, your target market, are gonna face, and that just makes sense. So I just want to name check a couple of things, because sometimes we think these vulnerability resources or these ways of testing, we have to pay for them. So Matt was making an excellent point there about using external sources. A really great one is the website accessiblenumbers.com. Numbers play a huge part in our communications, but often we overlook those alongside kind of plain English. In terms of design of products and services, another great resource is Koga, not Cougar, Philip. I saw your eyebrows go up there. Koga, COGA, which is a design template for people who have learning disability or difficulties with comprehension and cognition. Some really great free resource cases. I see in the chat, Richard Farr mentioned the vulnerability support framework from Commentis. So I just wanted to make that point. You don't always have to pay. And there are things like biases with staff groups when you do testing, because obviously, number one, they've got a job, which is a bias in the sense of a vulnerability. But to kind of answer your question, you know, yes, we need to be embedding this design approach. We talk about inclusive design and embedding it. How do we take account? How do we foresee and anticipate the difficulties our customers might experience? And that boils down to something that comes from TCF in the old days, knowing your customer. It really is back to some of these basics.
Chris, before you come in there, if you watch the webinar, the FCA webinar, where they interviewed a number of panelists, practitioners, as well as regulators there, I noticed that the individual representing Allianz basically said that we were actually understanding and grasping things from the front line, and then we embedded their feedback within our process improvement, as well as our product and service improvement, and voila, things started to shift there. We sometimes ignore what's in front of us, don't we, in terms of like actually working with the people, working with the resources, and maybe a shift or a step change in our approach to learning and training would actually give us those marginal gains that Matt has alluded to.
This is about making sure that your business is as customer-led as possible, I think. The quote of, if Amazon did vulnerable customers, it would all be about personalization. So the more personalized you can make the offering to the customers, arguably, the more marginal gains you're going to make. And there are many opportunities to do that by, as you said, Philip, taking data and complaints data, voice the customer narratives, surfacing those up regularly to the executive teams to make sure that everyone is really thinking about this and really obsessed about delivering great customer outcomes for both vulnerable and resilient customers alike.
So how do firms make that step change? So we talked about products and services, and there, Chris F. Are we seeing firms understand that and embed that right now? Was that an iterative process where firms are not marginalizing vulnerable customers and actually doing what Matt was saying before the webinar, which is kind of like having dual track product design teams to create products and services for vulnerable customers, but also for non-vulnerable customers? Are we seeing that really embedded within the psyche and the culture and the DNA of the firm, or is it still, we don't know what we're trying to achieve there?
So I think people still feel overwhelmed by vulnerability. I still feel a lot of firms and staff don't quite grasp actually where they begin or what they need to do, even though we've had a decade of vulnerability. I've been into over 600 firms, and we do get the same questions, and often from firms you expect it to be much further down the line. So I think firms are overwhelmed. So having that golden thread, whether it's those 3 questions I mentioned earlier or something entirely different, is really important to the culture that we create. I think the second thing is that this, and it's boring, it's drip, drip, drip. Now, the FCA are very persistent in telling us we think the same information again and again, but there's a reason why they keep telling us it, because they want us to do something about it. And I think the same applies to our staff and our working culture. We have to build that golden thread of vulnerability into everything we do. And that's not just kind of one-off training programs, it's huddles, it's insight packs, it's making sure your QA team understand not just the names of the protocols or the tools or the ways in which to handle disclosure or understanding around vulnerability, but actually understand it in detail, in depth. People feel invested in, and that happens again and again and again. So it's embedding this into the culture. And I think that's achieved in the Consumer Duty in 10.6 talks about 4 pillars. And I think it really is quite important. That's purpose. Are we showing a clear cultural purpose around vulnerability? Leadership. A leader's not just talking about vulnerability, but showing how things need to be done. Yeah, demonstrating this. It's us, the people. Are we delivering good outcomes, and is that kind of reflected in the way in which we're rewarded or managed or recognized? And there's that governance element, and that spells a very nice acronym, plug, P-L-U-G. So do you need to plug the gaps in your vulnerability culture? I can see Philip is grimacing there. Or do you actually need to plug it into the mains? And I think that culture and that persistence is really, really key. Sorry, Philip, you're kind of cringing there. That was kind of
turn it in. Plug. Okay, right. Wasn't that a Beano character at all?
It was the Bash Street Kids.
Yeah, that's it. That's it. Yeah, old school. Okay, right. Segue nicely, culture and leadership. This, what we've talked about, products to service design, better outcomes monitoring, outcomes testing. It's not going to happen, Chris A, is it? Because there are a few culture blockers in the way that firms keep banging their head about. Emily Shepherd talked about the other month about culture being contagious. And I think that it was a reminder to the whole sector that you just can't take your foot off the gas if you want to see continuous improvement. And certainly there has to be a demonstration of that in your consumer duty report. But what gets in the way of firms actually wanting or needing to shift that culture in a positive direction?
I think one of the biggest challenges is the fact that businesses are quite siloed generally, and it's a product of the industrial age. If you think about it, we've always built products, and that has then manifested itself in different functional stovepipes, different regional activities, and the customer experience and outcome kind of has to be a collection of all those things together, especially if you're getting into more complex kind of issues. And when you look at vulnerability and you see some of the really horrendous things that have happened to customers that have got characteristics of vulnerability that are getting bounced from pillar to post, let's say in a call center, a lot of those problems are because the organization is very stovepiped. So I think the new game now is for really building that cross-functional focus on resolving root causes of problems associated with good customer outcomes, vulnerability. One of the ways to address that, of course, is, we talked about great training, but there are other ways as well, whether it's, staff workshops or maybe something like, competency embedding solutions, things that really test the understanding of employees that they know what to do. And don't just rely on a single function to fix things when they go wrong from a customer. It's not just up to the call center to resolve things. It has to be taken more cross-functionally to really get to the heart of the matter.
Matt, you talked about culture in your own personal experience with dealing with an insurer there, where perhaps the intention was right, but the execution was wrong. And from your point of view, there was a disconnect, not a malicious disconnect, but something which was an unintentional consequence. Is that where kind of like culture rubs up against process?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's interesting, and just for the context of everybody that's trying to understand why I sound like an emphysemic Darth Vader, I went through treatment for throat cancer in 2023. And as you'd expect, treatment for throat cancer somewhat hinders your capacity to speak. And I was non-verbal for a number of months. And navigating the NHS as non-verbal, you'd be surprised at how hard that is, even in cancer wards designed specifically for throat cancer. Not great. But dealing with a health insurer where the only mechanism to make a claim was through a telephone line was somewhat restrictive. So for me, I had that personal experience of being vulnerable, had that personal experience of navigating, and it was no doubt that the insurer had designed the process to be more personal by making it a telephone line. Really kind of, I could see that there was good intentions there, but I'm a weird case. Throat cancer is not that common, and people becoming non-verbal with throat cancer isn't that common, and therefore I am one of those little outliers. Planning for me coming along in your business isn't something that everybody can do, and yet this is why when you look at the FCA's report, it talks about flexibility, and going back to Chris's point earlier, that idea of trying to think outside the box. It's how do I shift? How do I pivot when I come across a customer that I don't understand, that I don't have all of the ways of dealing with? And I think that that's something that's really useful for us to consider. Now, in my case, I'm a ballsy bugger, and even without a voice, I was now able to kind of holler and shout a little bit. And I was able to find an individual in that insurer who was able to communicate with me via email and was extremely responsive. But it was a fight, and it wasn't something that they did because they'd set themselves up for success. It was an individual taking on themselves to take responsibility. So when we think about culture here, that idea that Chris said about empowering staff is critical. But then I think the other part of this is that governance piece. Who has authority in a business? Well, your senior team, they've got license to tell people, I want you to be able to get off the rails, think differently, and adapt your process flexibly to your customers. And that messaging is critical to be able to get anywhere when you're dealing with forms of vulnerability that you can't anticipate.
And how are things now?
I'm now a bigger gobshite than ever I've been.
Yes, that's why I invited you to this webinar. So yes, yes. Incoming, yes. And well done, well done. And it's good to see you back in the saddle as well, Matt. So I appreciate your time on this webinar. But that, Chris F, that puts a telling point here. And I think I want to name check and big up the FCA on this, because where they do a case study or scenario within the review, they say where a senior manager intervened, they gave permission to actually, quoting Matt, go off the rails to actually make sure that they addressed that particular question. Are you seeing enough of that happening in the sector where senior managers are willing to get into the weeds and are willing to actually override and circumvent systems and processes for the betterment of better outcomes?
Yeah, we see that more and more compared to the very limited range of supports that used to be in place. Traditionally, maybe around terminal illness, maybe around bereavement, maybe around some forms of disability. But we've seen a widening and expansion of these. And I mentioned the support needs guide we had earlier, which tries to capture some of this. The thing I would say there is that it is really, really good to go the extra mile for a customer, and that makes a lot of sense. But it does bring up the issue of consistency and setting precedents that you need to be sure that you can meet for other customers. And I thought it was really interesting, the example in the FCA review where they spoke about a customer being called back every 3 weeks by, I think, by the same person. And I was thinking, well, okay,
Yeah,
that's really admirable and that's really, really great to see. But how how consistently could you meet that target in a range of different size firms? And it does also raise really interesting questions about how far do firms go in terms of the support they provide. I've noticed my background is in public health. I'm a fellow of the Royal Society for Public Health. I was at Imperial College and Royal College of Psychiatrists before this work. There's a really interesting overlap between what the commercial sector is doing compared to what the welfare state and charities used to do. I think there's a really interesting debate to have here at some point around, okay, what are the expectations about how far commercial firms can go and how effectively they can act? And we see some great initiatives around domestic abuse, I think, where organizations say, come into our branch and we'll give you a flea fund. We've seen Nationwide have Admiral Nurses, I think, in some of their branches as well. Really interesting initiatives. But I think we just need to be cautious and measured about how far we're going to go, not because it's the wrong thing to do, because it's the right thing to do only if we do it consistently.
yes. And how do we get that consistent approach in terms of like embedded within our culture is what people say and do on a day-to-day level, Chris, isn't it? And, you know, that has to be hardwired into the DNA of the firm, just like LV are doing, using and leveraging Clever Nelly.
Yeah, I certainly don't want to overpitch EDF at this point, but the stats are there. We've got some great examples of customers that have driven employee competence and have measured it and have proven that that has helped with customer outcomes. So you can see the data there on the LV slide.
And resources to make sure that people are on it and up to date and grasp the art of the possible.
Yeah, there's some great information there about how Clever Nelly can help the customers and all the people on the webinar today.
Fantastic. We've got an opportunity to open it up for questions. Panelists, can I encourage you to look at both the chat as well as the Q&A. We've got 12 questions in the Q&A as well as the chat there. Quick fire round, fingers on buzzers. If you see a question that you want to desperately answer there, please do so. Don't need me to intervene to jump on that there. But I think that there's an opportunity here for all of us to actually learn from each other as well as from the panelists that have shared the last 45 minutes with you there. I also want to give you an opportunity to indicate where you possibly could engage and reach out to Matt, Chris, F, as well as Elephants Don't Forget, to actually make a step change in your advancement of your vulnerability program. Certainly, I think that there were some more questions and answers were raised after the review. And so the key is to implement and embed. And if you want to reach out to Clever Nelly to improve employee competence, great, fantastic. Certainly reach out to Chris A there. Find out where the Money Advice Trust Consultancy Training offers help and support, and added to those 60,000 people who've gone through their training programs. Also reach out to Matt to actually review your approach to vulnerable customers. We'll leave it there, but any questions that you have that you want to Chris F address?
There's a really good one. I'd be really interested in what Matt and Chris make of this. It's from Richard Farr, Philip, and he's asking about the concept of screening all customers for vulnerable circumstances at initially point of first contact as well as ongoing. So I don't know, Chris and Matt, I've got views on this, but I'll kind of open it up as a conversation. What's your view?
I want to hear your views, Chris, but it's one that jumped out at me, and it was the one that I was going to pick as well, because I genuinely believe that this goes back to Chris A's first comment about proactive, not waiting to hear a thing from a client to then say, oh, is that a sign of vulnerability? But to actively screen clients sounds like such an intelligent way of approaching it. And it links to a comment that was also made in the chat earlier, which is that there are forms of vulnerability that the individual themselves might not be aware of. This is not something that we know always, that we're experiencing a vulnerability that a financial services firm might be able to help make an adaptation for to support us. They can't do the at 1+1 thing. So I think that that idea of screening is valuable, and it links really nicely in with this notion of how do you search for things that customers might not just be concealing, but they don't even know you could help them with.
Great point. My brother Chris, before I come in, what do you reckon?
All I was going to say is that, FCA talks about 21 different types of vulnerability, 4 categories. We know there are many, many more forms of vulnerability, and there are degrees of vulnerability, and many of them can happen at the same time. So I would just ask people to take a step back and think, how far are they going with this topic? Are they all in? Is their culture really up for this? Or are we just going to sort of tick the box of, hey, let's just do the minimum viable product that we can get away with, if I can be so blunt, right? This is a great opportunity to do the right thing by the customer, deliver great customer outcomes, and have really competent staff in delivering on that mission. So, just see it as a great business opportunity, not just something that has to be done just to get it over the line for the FCA. Philip, do you mind if I just briefly just mention about this slide that's in front of everyone that all people are already responding to, just to set very brief context on it?
Crack on.
So yeah, with Consumer Duty Conference, we want to know from everyone on this call that could be so kind as to tell us. We'd love to put on the industry conference around consumer duty, all aspects of the duty, including vulnerability, with some of the best partners out there, including the likes of Bovill and the Money Advice Trust. But these kind of things don't come cheap, unfortunately. We're not trying to make a profit. We'd give any sort of proceeds over to a charity, vulnerability charity, probably. If you'd like to respond to this, it'd be really helpful for us to know, is this the right thing for us to do, and get all you folks on the call together in person to celebrate all the great things that you're doing, and really look at, share war stories or things that we can do together to improve the industry and deliver a better service as well for our vulnerable customers. So thanks for your response.
So it's not only Oasis that are going on tour this year. So if you can't get tickets to Wembley, then you can get tickets to the Consumer Duty Conference there, which we are going to support. So don't worry, standing room only, O2 Arena or bigger, and there. Chris, I've heard the question.
Yeah, I've heard there'd be more trouble at the Consumer Duty Conference between the Gallaghers. I was just going to
maybe.
Yeah, I was just going to add, in terms of screening, my background for part of it was working in sexually transmitted disease clinics in Russia. That's another story. So screening has a very kind of fixed meaning for me. I would say it's about asking, onboarding, a bit like the Lloyds Banking Group are moving towards doing, about any support needs and normalizing that. You've got to be sure that you can then deliver those support needs. No point collecting information that you're not going to use, GDPR, or it's going to lead to a bad customer expectation and experience. But that's really important. And we're seeing other things as well, Philip, around data sharing, things like Support Hub which is nationwide, Lloyds and others, around where the consumer can share their information about their support needs with multiple organisations in one go.
Hmm. You know, I'm going to ask about GDPR then.
I've written a 4-volume guide. No one asked me to, but we have written a 4-volume guide on vulnerability in GDPR.
Okay, so coming into land, and if you could post that in the chat there,
Will
Bob,
do.
that's a good response. And we must have rehearsed this webinar as well. So what can firms do? We've talked a lot about it. We've done a whistle-stop tour of the review. Matt, one or two things that firms could say, you know what, I've learnt this, I'm going to take away this from this webinar, I'm going to do this differently. And also perhaps proffer some advice about the organization that our webinar attendees are going to go back to have to actually, simplify this and narrow it down into a case for support for funds or for further training, etc.
So I think the first and primary thing is that we need to have better engagement through into the senior team within organizations. And we need their buy-in to be able to gauge whether or not we're doing enough. There's a great couple of questions in there. How do we change culture? How do we know if we're doing enough? Well, actually, we should always be looking to do more, and we should always be taking the challenge to ourselves to do more. But it's only in and amongst the senior team are they empowered to be able to do that trade-off between it costing money and us achieving something. And it's that trade-off which is hard, and that's why the guys that earn the big bucks need to put their brains to these problems and not be held kind of separate from them. This is not a question for ops teams. This is a question for the board, and they should be engaged with it. That's the key thing for me. And then how do we get them to engage more? We need to start thinking about how we present the story of vulnerable customers and customer outcomes better than we have been. Data is great, as I say, but we've got to find out better ways to start communicating that with them to get them engaged.
Love that. Chris F?
I think we should remember for senior leaders, vulnerability is mentioned 109 times in the consumer duty. There's your fun fact for the day, Philip. And we shouldn't think, okay, vulnerability is now over. We can rely on the consumer duty to deliver all of that. I think that's incorrect. Again, as we've seen with firms who just rely on the duty framework for vulnerability, we often see quite poor returns, quite poor definition of vulnerability and poorer outcomes. And I think the second thing is you really understand something when you can simplify it. And we mentioned that vulnerable to what, supported how, if not us who. If you can actually simplify your approach to vulnerability into something that's sticky culturally, I think that really helps, because then the board, right down to the guys on the front line, everybody's looking at it in the same way and asking the same types of questions.
Adlard, I've changed your name, by the way.
I think number one is ask the question, how many vulnerable customers do you have in your system? So the Financial Life Survey from the FCA says up to 50% of customers could be vulnerable. It's probably a lot more than that in some cases, but ask that basic question, how many vulnerable customers? Secondly, define what good outcomes should be for those vulnerable customers, and then start putting in place programs to address it. And part of that obviously is making sure your staff are competent to deliver on those outcomes.
Just a quick question before we wrap up there. Has the FCA given enough clarity and understanding around this topic of vulnerability?
We could do with more. A very quick comment. The return on the amount of data and time that was shared with the FCA, I think maybe is a little bit unbalanced. So I did ask Charlotte Clark when I interviewed her, is there going to be more from the FCA on vulnerability? And she said, I'll take that away. We've all heard that before, I'm sure, in different meetings. But I do think quite seriously, there is a whole host of data there outside of the financial life surveys, which I'd really love to see surfaced into the light of day.
Matt?
I am a former regulator myself, so I'm allowed to say it. I think that the regulator works in some fairly interesting ways, and their communication is circumspect. It doesn't always get to the nub of what we're really trying to achieve. And this report does an okay job, But I think that where we're really getting to is that they're expecting to see something and they haven't got that many examples of what they're looking for in the real world. And actually, I'd love to see more resources made available to the industry, coordinated by the FCA, to share what examples we have of good practice, because it's actually through those examples that all of us feel better able to start lobbying our own internal stakeholders to do something differently, but also just be inspired to do something differently. And those resources, the FCA doesn't feel comfortable with making available all the time. And yet this is an example where I'd love to see the FCA take that sort of position and support the existing resources that are already out there to be able to start sharing the networks that already exist, but actually coordinate from the FCA and have a massive impact. I'd love to see that.
Just, I mean, sorry, you've got 30 seconds left. I'm just wondering, as you were asking that or answering that question, Matt, is there firms in your experience that have demonstrated, and Chris F, jump in here, who've demonstrated competitive advantage as a result of really going the extra mile in terms of their approach to vulnerability? Because isn't a customer-centric culture meant to drive profitability, benefit to society as well, and also fulfill the purpose? If you read the FCA's documentation, have you seen case studies and examples of that?
Monzo, Lloyd's Bank, Nationwide on DDEF customers, Lloyd's Bank on setting really good kind of data standards, but also a great customer interface on their app. And Monzo being so transparent, they got kudos and plaudits for things they hadn't done yet, but yet they announced them in their blogs and their transparent approach to customers, and were seen as the gambling block, being a real example of that.
Matt?
Chris's examples are much crisper than mine, but I think for me, firms that have genuinely embraced the idea that their commercial success is through striving to achieve the best outcomes for their customers are the ones that build genuine relationships. Those relationships are stickier, which means that you're able to retain clients, which means that from a profitability point of view, the lifetime value of every client is worth much more to you. It's not really that hard from a commercial point of view to justify treating them as being at the center of your universe. We struggle with it as an industry. Yeah,
we talked about that, Chris A, in the MPS webinar with Fred Reichard there just before Christmas there. It's not rocket science to love your customers, is it?
No, I would agree with everything everyone's just said. Simple as that.
Yeah. On that note, all you need is love. And then thank you very much for participating in this webinar. It's been great fun. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Chris F, DJ, Chris A. Thank you for being on the wheels of steel for the last 55 minutes. Thank you for sharing, Matt, your personal story as well. Do appreciate it. And thank you, the audience, because without you, this would be
thank you.
Four guys talking to each other. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Take care, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.